Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
When I was in grad school, there used to be actual sort of Wikipedia sit-ins, like Women Edit Wikipedia, where we all kind of change the Wikipedia entries to be more favorable toward women or to, increase the role of women in history, because this is, seizing control of the narrative if you can just sort of invisibly inject your ideology under the skin of one of the major sources of information that people use. Now, of course, right in school, we were all taught to double check Wikipedia, but again, just like how many lefties are going to really sort of remember whether or not AOC was truly handcuffed, like how many people are really going to look into the background of what they discover on Wikipedia. Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And I'm joined by a full crowd today, which is excellent. We've had sort of different configurations throughout the summer, but today I am joined by editor James Poulos, managing editor Seth Barron, and publisher and president Ryan Williams. So we have lots to talk about, and the whole gang is here to discuss. We thought we'd start out with kind of a package on, we're calling it the left post row, or we'll see if that turns out to be quite the right title in a bit. But you've probably seen some of the headlines that are involved in this. One is the great, to me, just delightful video of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez along with some other House Democrats, Ilhan Omar, and, the usual cast of characters outside the Capitol. Big sort of chant, march, the typical protest against Roe v. Wade. Our bodies, our choice. We won't go back. All the stuff you may imagine. And, I guess they were eventually escorted off the scene by police. They're officially calling it an arrest, but the video that really kind of sums the whole thing up shows AOC walking next to a police officer with her hands behind her back as if being handcuffed, but then she immediately raises her fist in the kind of, universal power sign, initially Black Power, then sort of leftist amalgam power sign. And Ilhan Omar, it's actually even better. Not many people have seen this clip, but she's unlike AOC, who's walking at least with a police escort. Ilhan just walks with her hands behind her back and does the same thing. Flashes the same power symbol in another sort of fake arrest montage. I really like we are now having an imaginary civil rights movement by imaginary brave people to protest the rollback of an imaginary right. It seems incredibly fitting, actually, but I shouldn't perhaps make such light of it, only because this sort of grandstanding is, taken seriously by a non-negligible portion of America's now, I think, increasingly miseducated population. And it speaks to one, I think, dimension of the, what's going to be part of leftist demagoguery going forward. The kind of line that's taking shape is, well, there's a theocracy of domestic terrorists that are gathering in the shadows, slowly gaining power. I even heard, I can't remember who I heard talking about the kind of internal coup, or a coup from within, that you use the system, elections and judges and those sorts of scary things to subvert our democracy, which, as Seth is often fond of pointing out, really does mean our democracy, as in not yours. And so we wanted to, in light of that kind of take on the thing, to incorporate a few other news stories, including this vote in the House over gay marriage, which just seems to have kind of rolled out basically overnight. There was a vote. It's being kind of billed as the vote to codify gay marriage into law, to codify Obergefell, in case, because the looming threat that, Clarence Thomas and his fellow theocrats are going to undo all the left's advances, including Obergefell gay marriage. In point of fact, what this vote actually would do if it became law would overturn the Defense of Marriage Act, which is still on the books, even though it hasn't been effective since Obergefell. And what that in turn would do is not codify Obergefell so much as codify Windsor, which was the case that in 2013 stopped, basically if you get married, gay married in a state that allows it, like New York, then federal benefits accrue to you across state lines, because, Windsor was applying for exemption from, I think, the inheritance tax. So that's sort of the content of the bill. The substance of it seems to be a kind of gotcha rolled out by House Democrats. It will now go to the Senate. And there's, many people have been sharing the list of the House Republicans that did vote for this and the House Republicans that didn't. 47 in total voted, I'm reading from Politico here, to write same-sex marriage into law. Again, kind of a misleading headline, but speaks to this notion that, right, there's going to be a vast rollback. We have to prepare and erect bulwarks against the coming coup of justices and judges. Another portion of this is the upcoming, I guess, attempt to force a vote in the House on adding 4 justices to the Supreme Court, which is court packing. This has been part of the quote-unquote discourse since before Biden was in office. And AOC has sort of pounded her fist about it a lot to bring her back into the picture. This idea that, in order to safeguard hashtag our democracy, what we really need, since there's no fixed number of justices in the Constitution, we need to add more and more and more justices. This is something that we at The American Mind have published a great deal about why that would be a disaster, why it is not standard practice to simply add or subtract justices to the court. And you can find, if you just search court packing in our archives, you'll find any number of articles that I would recommend on why this is a disastrous idea. But I'll leave it for now at that. I mean, what do you guys think? Is this, we've talked a lot about the kind of guerrilla style ground tactics of the new American left, this sort of politics by riot and that sort of thing. But it does seem to me as if this is another trend that is emerging in the wake of Dobbs. They're kind of, the attempt is to use this as the harbinger, the sort of supposed harbinger of all sorts of nasties that might come rolling down the pike. Some of which I should say, by the way, are not nasties, including the overturn of Obergefell, in my opinion. But that's really neither here nor there. I mean, first of all, do you guys agree that this seems to be sort of their new tactic, and do you think it'll work?
Well, it's a good question. Yes and no. I mean, part of the strategy, right? The left since the 60s has a pretty good track record of using street action to get its way, especially if you take a horizon of a decade or 3. So I don't see why they should stop from their own point of view. I guess the one wild card would be, with everything on video, much more so these days, and the declining ability of the regime media, that is most of the mainstream media, to frame all this in a way favorable to the causes of the left. And so you have the quick blow up of the sort of half fake handcuff behind your back thing with AOC. Maybe this will all have declining efficacy. But so far, I think we've yet to see that play out. So I don't see why they wouldn't keep on it. And in the sense, you mentioned it in your intro, Spencer, our democracy means, and we've said this before, as you mentioned, Seth says it quite a bit. It's been really a theme of this podcast from the beginning in some ways. Our democracy is the specific set of de jure policy and principled or justice, scare quotes, picture them, of the left at the current moment. Our regime is that basket of rights, those policies, those opinions that are acceptable and good. That is our democracy. So any part of the normal democracy or normal republicanism, American style, degraded as it is today, that results in anything else is de facto illegitimate. That includes people who are elected who are bad, quote unquote bad, and it certainly includes Supreme Court decisions or other policy outcomes or lack of policy movement, as we're seeing a big theme just today with Biden saying he's going to push the pedal to the floor on, a climate emergency and turn on, this is how the reporting is going. Biden now, can turn on or activate all sorts of executive powers to use on climate because of his declaration of a climate emergency. So yeah, that's so definitely part of the strategy. Street action is effective, especially for the left. Interestingly, one of the lopsided aspects of our current regime and the troubling aspect of it to many of us is that you seem to have two different justice tracks for regime partisans and regime enemies, for lack of better, more precise terms. And so, right-wing protest will very likely get you much more than AOC's $50 fine. It could get you civil rights prosecutions. It could get you indefinitely or pre-trial detention for 18 months for showing up in the Capitol on January 6th and that sort of thing. So the left has that added advantage too. It has a lot more leeway in street protesting. And so to the extent that they can push that envelope more, I suspect it will be more effective in the realm of public opinion, as long as they can, not seem too lunatic, which it's been a mixed bag on the abortion stuff. Maybe the AOC arrest will turn out to be good optics and good politics for the left, but a bunch of shrieking blue-haired people with fake menstrual blood on their jeans maybe won't be.
Yeah, I agree, especially about this point that, there's two standards regarding the reaction to protest. When the left protests, it really doesn't even matter what they do. They see it as First Amendment protected activity, even though civil disobedience, by definition, is not First Amendment protected activity. It's intentionally breaking the law to draw attention to a cause. But they've lost the whole moral stature that civil disobedience obtains comes from the fact that the protester is willing to face punishment and accept the punishment. Like Thoreau, okay, he didn't have a major punishment, but Gandhi spent time in prison. Martin Luther King was willing to, okay, I broke the law. Yes, it's an unjust law, but I will take whatever punishment I get. Today's left doesn't get that part. They think that because they're protesting in what they see as a good cause, there should be no consequences. And it really kind of doesn't matter what they do. At the same time, the right, even for indicating an interest in protest. Look, Giuliani is now facing criminal charges in Georgia, but it's hard to tell exactly what the crime in Georgia was. That they wanted to look at the election. That seems like pretty normal. They didn't attack anybody. They didn't. I'm still baffled as to what the crime is supposed to be there. AOC is comical. People probably saw a week ago, this jokester, sort of political prankster, Alex Stein, was yelling at her as she was going into the Congress and talking about how sexy she looked, even though she wants to kill babies. And it's really like, may a cat look at a king. She was so offended that he dared to comment towards her that she first she said she was going to go beat him up, but then she apparently called the Capitol Police 5 times and asked them, why aren't they arresting him? Why is he permitted to yell at a member of Congress? Now, he said things about her rear end. So she said, well, that's sexual harassment. So it's not protest. But again, I can't imagine that there would be similar concern if, there isn't similar concern. The left constantly is attacking Ted Cruz when he walks out of a restaurant, threatening Brett Kavanaugh. The fact that a guy was caught with a gun outside Brett Kavanaugh's house doesn't raise any eyebrows. And, were some leftists to act violently, I think that it would be sort of seen as, well, people will do what they do, as Nancy Pelosi famously said.
Yeah, it's not terribly surprising, I guess. I mean, this is a movement that is morphing into a religion of sorts. Religions need martyrs, and martyrs are pretty high status in religions. And so political religions want political martyrs. And this is a political movement, and increasingly a religious one, that wants its people especially, to get really excited about, to see almost as sacred fake life, a life that is withdrawn from the real world, withdrawn from the human nature, withdrawn from natural rights, withdrawn from the life of a citizen, as we have understood it these many years. And so how do you model a kind of fake martyrdom in the service of this political religion? Well, you get your big political celebrities out onto the streets, the ones who who are designed to attract the imitation of your would-be foot soldiers, and you have them go through this kind of ritualistic charade. They're good at doing this. They seem to derive some kind of pleasure out of it, satisfaction, independent of whatever the political payoff might be. And so, I expect this to continue, and I think they want their fans and supporters to expect it to continue too.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Seth, when you're talking about AOC's furious crusade of righteous indignation, it bears mentioning also that that's after she's on the video, like flashing a peace sign with Stein and kind of altogether behaving in a way that is like a little bit more kind of classy and self-deprecating. And I think it seems like he sort of half tricked her at first, or she maybe thought he was a supporter. And before she had like gained full control over her public image in that moment, she was just kind of laughing it off. And then when she realized that it was actually somebody trying to make her look like a fool, she designed this enormous, civil rights, cultural oppression narrative. And she's very effective at it in the mode that James is describing. I mean, that's why, although it's hilarious, it's also kind of troublesome. She's very sort of deft in her instincts for the internet. Like, I remember very vividly how she, after January 6th, she talked about how she was crying in the in her offices, which were sort of not in the same building, but that's another issue. And she was afraid that she might get raped. And then she sort of uncovered her own, history of sexual trauma. And it all just sort of washed up into this big stew of like, AOC was raped on January 6th by domestic terrorists. Like, there was this amazing act of narrative construction that she kind of semi-instinctively, but also I think really intentionally conflated this problem from her past with Me Too, with this big, Reichstag fire moment. It was all very sort of deftly done in a very digital native sort of way. And this is one way in which like AOC and Trump are weirdly kind of doppelgangers of each other to me, is that like, obviously I like one better than the other, but they both have a certain intuitive feel for the contours of internet communication, internet narrative building. I do sort of wonder, like, when I asked how effective is this going to be, there's kind of a sense in which, you guys remember when Michelle Obama was like, when they go low, we go high. I feel like that was like less a distinction between Republicans and Democrats and more like battle tactics between different kinds of Democrats. It's like, while our kind of shock troops rove the streets and perform whatever acts of lawless violence they want, in the name of our supposed high rhetoric, we will be out here manufacturing the high-flown rhetoric and creating the sort of smokescreen that, it justifies extreme acts of emergency, shut down the economy over the climate. There's sort of these things seem like two separate prongs, but they're actually of a piece, because you can't riot in the streets unless you have people sort of nobly aspiring to the next civil rights crusade in the wake of the coming theocracy. It's all very, when you sort of get inside the logic of it, it's all very deftly done.
Yeah, there's that Seth mentioned, the guy outside Kavanaugh's house with a gun. There's this kind of dark edge to this trend on the left, which is nothing new. It goes back to Mao's Cultural Revolution. It's an old fascist tactic. So we don't even need to confine it to the left, although I won't trot out the hoary cliches of the fascism just being of the right. It's silly. But anyway, the whole street militia, control the streets aspect of a nation in turmoil, of street justice, of mob tactics, all of that, has a pretty dark edge, because ultimately its root principle is triumphing by force. The question is, what kind of force and at what level? And I hear through the grapevine from a very reliable source, I will use the secondhand, remain nameless and not cite the location or anything, but it comes reliably reported to me privately that the Supreme Court, the four especially who signed on to Dobbs, or who were ready to publish a Dobbs opinion in June, when that opinion leaked, to them it seemed a very real threat, in the sense that, that opinion was not published yet. That majority was inchoate, but not yet on paper and not yet official. And so it seemed to them very likely that part of the goal with leaking it was to get one of them killed. Because if one of them were taken out, the votes wouldn't be there, as we saw with Roberts. Roberts was the fifth vote, but he didn't sign on to the full opinion. He concurred in the judgment. So that, and I don't think that's an unreasonable conclusion, given the stakes of our modern rolling regime crisis. And, those judges, all of them really, justices on the Supreme Court in their own ways, are sober-minded and at their best, all 9 of them, that is, and serious people, whatever we may think about their political or policy preferences as they manifest themselves in opinions. But that seems to me to be just proof of the stakes of what's going on. And even if the chance was very remote that such a thing would happen, it seems like that's part of the logic of these kinds of tactics, that ultimately, if what's at stake is democracy itself, or the avoidance of some sort of totalitarian theocracy, if, to go back to one of our themes of the recent years, if Trump is literally Hitler, then really all means are on the table to stop such a regime, or stop its momentum, or stop its preferences from becoming law, or carrying the day with public opinion. I think violence is lurking in the dark shadow of a lot of this, and we would be naive and would be silly historicists of the left that we criticize if we didn't think this kind of regression to that ugliness isn't possible.
Hang on a sec, Ryan. Did you just call? I may have missed it. It went by so fast. Did you just call Sonia Sotomayor a serious person? Is that those words just come out?
Alas, she is deadly serious. Yes. Again, look, she is. She's at least one.
She's a wise Latina
affirmative
woman.
Action hire on the Supreme Court. Let's be honest. I'll probably shock the left, but they probably thought I thought it anyway, and our friends on the right won't disagree. But she's nonetheless not a dumb person, or an unserious political actor.
Yeah, I mean, that leak thing kind of is amazing, especially for how quickly it has vanished from the public consciousness. Like, this really gets to me. How many people in DC must know who leaked that draft? I mean, it's impossible for me to imagine, knowing what I know about sort of how these elite circles work. It's impossible for me to imagine that the leaker was so serious about his or her task that nobody else knows but the person that did it, and they just imagine themselves as this lone vigilante. So it must be like an open secret in at least some circles. And certainly if we had a press worthy of the name, it would be the scoop of the century, to find who did this, and nothing. I mean, I don't think we're even making moves in that direction from what I can see. So that does speak to how much power the left has to define its own vigilantism, if indeed that's what we're looking at with the league, to define that as sort of appropriate and necessary, and then shuffle it neatly off stage. Let us now, speaking of redefining reality, talk about kind of I don't know, this is maybe a bit of a rabbit hole, but it's really, to me, quite fascinating and gives me an opportunity to tell a funny story from high school, which is always a plus. So I guess this all comes initially, the source of this news story is Quillette, where a person named Shuichi Tezuka, whose name I'm sure I'm also butchering, has compiled this really well-researched and, worth looking at article. It's called Cognitive Distortions: How the Culture Wars Came for Wikipedia's Articles About Human Intelligence. And the basic thrust here is that because Wikipedia is a publicly sourced database of supposedly true information, if you get a group of activists, a group of really any political party passionate enough about codifying its own view of things into Wikipedia, then and if they're energetic enough and thorough enough, they can really do a lot of damage to the site. And one area in which this is true is in the study of human intelligence. And this article goes through a number of cases in which you can see Wikipedia articles in real time. If you use like the Wayback Machine or if you use archive.is or whatever, you can see them getting Bowdlerized to exclude or at least to call into question information that is genuinely true, whether it's convenient or not. And so, of course, study of human intelligence, study of the heritability of IQ, right? The kind of stuff that somebody like Charles Murray has been writing about for a while is racially fraught. It raises all these questions. Well, are there, obviously, we at the Claremont Institute believe that there is a robust understanding of human equality, right, for the creator that doesn't actually depend on people being as smart as each other or as strong as each other or whatever. But because of the sort of bastardized idea of equality that has become so current, the idea that you might suggest, well, certain groups of people, ethnically or genetically have certain tendencies, that is itself a kind of sacrilege. And what do you do with sacrilege? You excise it from the public mind. And so this is what's happened with, I guess there's a field called psychometry or psychometry, which is it says that here's a member of Wikipedia saying scientific racism has infiltrated psychometry. It's a field where people who advocate scientific racism can push racist ideas without being constantly contradicted by the very work they're doing. And this is basically the notion that if you do study, the heritability of IQ, you are inherently pushing racism, or you're giving throwing up a quasi-scientific smokescreen so that you can just advance your own racist views. And what's most interesting here is this is case number 3 about the Flynn effect. And the Flynn effect has gotten kind of wrapped up in this cloud of suspicion about all results that might describe genetic basis for IQ, and that's because it studies the question. But what's really interesting is that the Flynn effect actually is the major piece of evidence against just locking people's IQ into their race. It turns out that there is a long-term possible increase in fluid and crystallized intelligence. I'm reading here from Wikipedia, and I'll get to why in a second. Fluid and crystallized intelligence test scores that were measured in many parts of the world over the 20th century. So this is an actually robust result that, in fact, it's not just a matter of your race, how smart you are. Even at the aggregate level, you can, in fact, aggregate groups can change and increase their IQ based on, nutrition and teaching and all sorts of things that you might expect. So this is the kind of thing that should be very encouraging to a truly meritocratic society. That, in fact, you can, encourage and lift up people throughout, whatever their ancestry may be. But because this is a result that studies the genetic impact of IQ, or the impact of genetics upon IQ, it got this little blurb on the Wikipedia page. This article may present fringe theories without giving appropriate weight to the mainstream view. So it's a remarkable instance of not only enthusiasm for memory holing inconvenient facts, but over enthusiasm. And what's even better or more riveting is that now, if you go, just before we started recording, went on Wikipedia to check this, and it looks like that warning is now gone. So you can actually watch this stuff happening in real time. This article has made enough of a splash that people are trying to cover their tracks by editing Wikipedia, or perhaps somebody that is sort of more pro-truth is editing Wikipedia to be more accurate. I'm not sure what happened, but it does. I dwell upon it because it raises something really interesting that we almost never talk about, which is that this sort of thing goes on all the time. When I was in grad school, there used to be actual sort of Wikipedia sit-ins, like Women Edit Wikipedia, where we all kind of change the Wikipedia entries to be more favorable toward women, or to, increase the role of women in history, because this is, seizing control of the narrative if you can just sort of invisibly inject your ideology under the skin of one of the major sources of information that people use. Now, of course, right, in school, we were all taught to double check Wikipedia, but again, just like how many lefties are going to really sort of remember whether or not AOC was truly handcuffed, how many people are really going to look into the background of what they discover on Wikipedia. And I will, before I hand it over to the group, tell one funny story from high school, which is that when I was in school, and Wikipedia was just starting to become something that our teachers were warning us against, a couple of my buddies edited the article for the Bataan Death March so that one of our pals was the leader of it. So for a week or something, this guy who was Asian, right, was the leader of the Bataan Death March on Wikipedia. And we tracked how long it took for them to take it down. It took a really long time for them to spot it. And our history teacher was actually applauded us for it because it demonstrated, how fungible Wikipedia is. But that's something that, as the site has gotten better and better, I mean, one thing the Quillette piece points out is that, notionally at least, Wikipedia articles get better and better as they go because more and more people add sources and ideas. But, people have sort of forgotten that this is actually a crowdsourced database, which is vulnerable to capture by extremely dedicated ideological interests. And so, my first question, I guess, for the group is, you might be inclined with this to say, well, the right should be doing this. The right should be seizing control of the Wikipedia narrative. But that just seems like kind of lame and also zero sum. What is in fact the correct response here to a digital world that is open to manipulation this way?
Well, I think Wikipedia has made it a little more difficult now for anyone to just go in and change certain topics. I think you have to be some kind of credentialed expert that, they credential in some way. Not in everything, but on many kind of hot button issues. Also, you don't have to use the Wayback Machine. All edits are stored right on the Wikipedia page. So, I mean, I've done this. Sometimes it's fun to just go and look and see what you can trace, the history of a debate, kind of looking at Wikipedia edits. And then there's chat, so people discuss it. It can be fairly lively and sometimes interesting. I guess I don't have an enormous amount to say about how this goes. I mean, it kind of relates to the question of libraries and what they call censorship. When here's a question that never gets asked. We hear all the time about, such and such book is censored or banned books week. But who really does most of the banning of books or the censoring of books are librarians. Through deaccession. So, I mean, there's plenty of books out there about, race that you would be hard pressed to get your hands on. Books that were common, say, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I mean, look at this. Forensic anthropologists, everybody says that, race, is just only skin deep. Yet at the same time, a forensic anthropologist can look at a skull and immediately tell you if the person was Asian or black or...
But not if they identified as female, we recently discovered.
Oh, yes, right. Well, they now want to, eliminate these standards of reading skeletons because it doesn't apply to... I mean, because, well, maybe you don't identify as a man or a woman, or maybe, you know, we're reifying race by talking about physical anthropology in this way. There was, regarding IQ, what I think is interesting, and I'd like to know what you guys think about this. The way I see it is that conservatives don't really mind talking about race and IQ so much, because they kind of understand that IQ, yeah, it's kind of an important thing to look at, but it doesn't describe the whole human being. So, but liberals, their own whole set of value is based on how smart they are. Like, since they don't believe in God, all they care about is whether people are smart. So to them, it's intolerable to talk about race and IQ, because if you accept that there's a connection, well, then you must become a genocidal maniac, because they don't actually like view people as anything but widgets. Maybe this is a bit of an extreme way to characterize the liberal viewpoint, but I think that's why they can't stand talking about it, because they just see people along this one dimension. Like, well, are they smart? I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you might be a little overdetermined there, but I think there's something to there's certainly there's a sense in which the left both accepts while rejecting, just sort of cherry picking certain aspects of these kinds of studies, right? I mean, what came to mind to me is they really don't like the link between genetic groups and general intelligence, because they accept, it seems to me, and this gets at your premise of their placing importance on being smart, they accept the pretty strong correlation between high IQ or general intelligence and, life outcomes, especially economic ones. So there's that class aspect to it as well. So they're kind of blank slaters when they need to be, but also accept, it seems to me, at least implicitly, depending on the argument, certain findings that have emerged from the study of genetics and heritability and all that, whether it be intelligence or much more mundane things. So no, I think there's definitely there's a lot of confusion because the truths with which we interpret and explain reality are contingent upon ideology for the left much more than the right. I mean, look, humans are rationalizers, and everyone is capable of cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning and all the rest. It's not a left phenomenon, but this sort of phenomenon that you, I think, got into with that example, which I've expanded upon a little bit, is real.
Yeah, in the spirit of being ecumenical about these things, take sort of what's going on with this medium view. The digital misinformation or disinformation or propaganda or whatever label you want to hang on it, just seems, to me at least, to be nowhere near the problem for our form of government and civic participation in that form of government. As bogus information, fake information that is verified, that is officially verified information by the regime or by the moderator class or by whatever corporate entity presumes to be unimpeachable in its verification systems. And this is where, you get with something like Wikipedia, you see the danger that is posed, not just to people sort of, self-selecting for one specific kind of feed, so that they all kind of create an echo chamber for themselves, or even people who, just frankly don't really care how accurate their understanding of what's going on is, or even how accurate their perceptions are. But beyond that is when you have people handing out the blue checks, the people deciding what counts as correct within that ecosystem, doing things like what Merriam-Webster's doing, where the dictionary definition of a woman is changing, and why is it changing, and who gets to say what the official definition is, and then the official definition becomes more important than the reality that is supposed to be affirmed by official definitions. And so, rather than just people duking it out over their own interpretations of events and phenomena and words, which is something that's been going on for a long time, and long may that kind of public tussle continue. This is much different, and it's something that we've experienced a bit with sort of the propaganda of the old style, but this is a much more sweeping and intimate and invidious form of again creating a sort of a substitute for reality, a simulation of reality, one that's intended to be in some bizarre way more real than real, or more encompassing, more comprehensive, more detailed than the base reality, so that people can be transferred over into that other realm, a realm that is controlled and has a form of governance that is delinked from all of the foundations that American governance and many other forms of government besides over the millennia have always been rooted in.
Yeah, it's sort of in this regard one way in which I'm very sympathetic to our friends who sort of think neutrality is fake. I mean, neutrality of this kind that is presented in the most naive and unblushing way does sort of protest a little bit too much. The blue check, the Wikipedia article, this is the official source. People on the right have been pointing out recently that this notion where, actually the authorities have provided for us this kind of blank slate where anything can be discussed and just the best view will win out, that people have become increasingly suspicious of that. And I wonder whether one reason why is because they're observing in real time the way in which even these ostensibly authoritative sources get edited and re-edited by politically interested, ideologically motivated parties. This was also a major feature of COVID, right? Here's the CDC, here's the WHO, these bodies that are, their whole reason for being is so that we can kind of heave a sigh of relief when they step on the scene and know that this is going to be the reliable take, right? This, whatever else we may debate, these are the givens because they come from, nonpartisan expert sources. And in fact, it turned out that whole system was like really bunk and extremely deceptive and deceitful and was always changing its mind and was very clearly kind of treading a certain party line. And, Dr. Fauci is in the New York Times saying like, well, initially I said that the vaccine threshold was one thing, but then it looked like I could maybe nudge it up a little bit. So I said something else. And it's like, why do you think people are so concerned about the science, capital S? It's the same reason, right? And I guess that as sort of to Ryan's point earlier, the more that this sort of thing becomes visible, which is one feature, I guess, one way at least you can use the internet to your advantage is to actually watch this stuff happen and understand and get wise to it. You can at least sort of disillusion yourself, can unburden yourself of the illusion that we live in this kind of pristine public square where there's, where neutrality sort of presides and may the best man win, because of course, like you can't have a society that doesn't take certain assumptions for granted. And what we're witnessing is an effort to, physically by main force seize control of what those assumptions are and place them outside the realm of debate. The left sort of implicitly understands this because they're always saying, well, we can never really overcome our biases. We can only be constantly aware of our biases and become more and more aware of them. But in fact, it turns out that their real project is to make you less and less aware of their biases. And that is something that I think to the extent that digital media has enabled people to puncture that facade, that is very much to the good.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to try something out, see what James thinks of it. So I'm always curious about what is new and what is not about our current situation. So in 1984 in fiction, or in the Soviet Union or modern China, in various ways, you have a centralized purveyor of official information and squelcher of disinformation, or wrongthink, I should say. Disinformation usually is a tool of state power rather than something ginned up by people scribbling on the internet. But now we have the rise of digital technology, the spread of digital media, the disaggregation of central sources of news, and so you have a certain small d democratization of knowledge. But at the same time, you have pretty successful attempts, it seems to me, to manipulate through various forms of subtle and not so subtle mass propaganda and official narrative shaping, to manipulate a good portion of the groupthink of that democracy and that democratization of knowledge. So you can kind of you can wield the levers of propaganda from the bottom and the top in a way, if you are a savvy state. And so my question always is, what is really at the sort of regime level, what is really new here, and what is just the same old stuff but with new tools? And also, or are we seeing a kind of new hybrid totalitarianism or soft totalitarianism that kind of wields the powers of democracy and exploits its weaknesses, especially its tendency to be cowish and herd-like, while also maintaining the older, more iron or crude levers of just good old-fashioned centralized state propaganda and coercion?
Well, I might say very briefly, we've got these waves of communications technologies, and they're nested. So what we've got now is like an echo chamber, like wrapped in a television inside a computer, and that is where, with apologies to Winston Churchill, that is where a lot of people reside, and that is where a lot of people are being encouraged to reside, and not just to reside in that sort of, that nested doll, but a nested doll that is organized and controlled by a specific kind of elite with specific ideas about the ultimate nature and purpose of our human being in the universe. So there are differences. I think there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, and in some ways that's for obvious reasons. In other ways, a better term to throw around might be something like automated simulators. We've got these computational devices. What are they good at doing? What is it that they do all the time? What is it that makes them so powerful and powerful in ways that we're unaccustomed to? Well, they're sort of like, they simulate people, they simulate trends, they simulate, increasingly they seem to simulate souls, and they, you wind them up and let them go. And it just experienced, over the past, since 2015 or so, a ruling class that thought it had wound these things up and let them go, and that the result would be just what they had always wanted. And that's not what happened. These things were wound up and let go, and they formed a certain kind of swarm that gave people interacting with those entities new kinds of forms of agency. And a lot of those people got together and used that opportunity to vote for Donald Trump in contravention of everything that was thrown at them as, the kind of nudging or conditioning or, outright attempts at just telling people what to do that would have led to what was expected to be the exact opposite outcome. And so it only made sense that the ruling class sort of looked at this, shocking experience and said, like, wow, we really need to do a better job of getting our arms around this swarm of automated simulators and learning from it how to sort of poke at it and condition it so that it starts to do things that we want it to do. And in fact, probably one of the best ways of doing that is to build a set of simulators to simulate the simulators. And then we can just have the super smart robots sort of tell the original swarm of robots what to do. I mean, this sounds kind of ridiculous, but it is what is going on. I quoted John Maynard Keynes talking about beauty contests at a recent Claremont event. Some transcripts from which will go up on the American Mind in the not too distant future. And it's weird to quote Keynes. Certainly wasn't quoting him on economic matters, but he said, look, we've kind of arrived at this point where the way that we approach problems or governance or really any kind of social structure is by not just having a beauty contest, but by having a contest to figure out sort of who the judges are going to pick in a beauty contest. And that, he sort of, with a wink said, I've heard that there are even people who are trying to, to do this at an even more meta level, and then a higher level after that and after that, implying that, the elite was really moving in a direction of trying to predict the future and trying to direct the powers of weaponry and science and technology and innovation toward predicting the future and to simulating reality and using that as their mode of governance, having basically lost faith in all the other ones. And I think, that's what we're seeing playing out right now. That's what a lot of Americans just think is creepy and weird, because it is. And a lot of elites think they really don't have much of a choice, that, other than that, the best thing that they can do is, go live in space or climb into their luxury Zeppelin and just kind of orbit the world. And it's coming to a head. And it's an irrepressible conflict.
I knew I'd get a good answer from that wind-up. Thank you, James.
Well, we are almost out of time. We did want to call one other thing to y'all's attention, and that is the fact that, like, all the COVID money has been stolen. This is another one of those stories that these things kind of loom over our collective consciousness. Things like COVID just dominate our lives, and then partly because of our just willingness to move past them and forget them, they sort of vanish into the background, but they continue to have these incredibly deleterious effects. And this is one of those examples where, so obviously when the COVID sort of freak out was at its height and lockdowns were very much a thing and everybody was, feeling the heat of the emergency, Congress passed a lot of spending, and some of it ended up in people's bank accounts, like directly. Some of it was tax breaks. Some of it was, the pausing student loan and so forth. But we sort of just forgot that happened, in part because our debt is ballooning so incredibly just at every moment that everything is just a drop in the bucket. But this article by Bloomberg crossed my path recently. It was on Real Clear Politics, and it really kind of shocked me, even though I guess I should have just known that this was going on. It begins with this sort of generous opening. In some respects, Congress's response to the COVID-19 pandemic amounted to a striking bipartisan success. Amid crisis conditions, legislators passed 6 laws, doling out more than $5 trillion in relief measures. That's trillion with a T. And that is a real thing that happened. In relief measures helping to keep businesses open, households afloat, and the economy from outright collapse. This is Reid while the government was also shutting down and depressing businesses and destroying the economy, but that's perhaps a story for another day. This is just to say that of this, there has been a massive amount, more than anyone really knows or apparently will ever know, that was just stolen through fraud and so forth. Here's another paragraph from that same article. All told, at least $163 billion out of $873 billion in total outlays was improperly spent, with a significant portion attributable to fraud. Outside estimates have put the figure at nearly 2.5 times higher. Meanwhile, as of March, the government had recovered just $4 billion or so. Most of the misbegotten funds are likely gone for good. So I just wanted to, I don't know, I'll toss that out to the group and see what you guys make of it. For me, it's like as they start making noise, it's about the summer surges again and potentially locking people down to increase mail-in voting for November. It's good to remember like that we did actually go through this and it was actually a complete disaster whose ramifications will be felt for many, many years to come.
It's also an interesting example of the public wheel being thieved on more than one level. So
2 times over, yeah.
The COVID money was stolen, but in the process of the massive relief packages and all the money printing, we've ginned up inflation. So not only was, this is all the public's money ultimately, kind of. I mean, the young kids we run across these days have concluded from the way fiscal responsibility in the federal government works in America that all money is fake and all debt is fake, but that ultimately isn't true, unfortunately. But nevertheless, so the COVID money that our congressional betters doled out to everyone was stolen en masse and enriched the wrong people. And then we've, through all this money printing, have saddled ourselves with what looked to be 9% quarterly inflation. And so the stolen COVID relief packages played a huge role in stealing all of your money and all of our money by eroding our purchasing power. So it's a wonderful circle of corruption and thievery.
I mean, like $1 billion went to unemployment claims by prisoners in California alone. like hundreds of thousands of dollars were paid to people on death row. Now, I don't know if they actually got it or if people just filed claims in their names. I mean, God knows. But yeah, I mean, clearly this was just like a massive, it's hard to even call it a wealth transfer because it was just like, they just made up all this money. Yeah, it seems like I mean, it's nothing surprising. I mean, I've heard of some cases of people who've been arrested and, they stole this money, $30 million in PPP funds and so forth, or, here and there. But, I mean, it sounds like there's trillions of new dollars floating around.
Yeah. And intelligent and enterprising crooks have made away with a lot of it. It's sort of, it's like part and parcel with, I mean, not really part and parcel, that's not right. But yeah, the declining murder clearance rate. I mean, any of these giant government bureaucratic systems, there's a lot of play in the joints for bad actors. And
that's for sure.
Everything from getting away with murder to getting away with grand larceny and theft.
And I think, Ryan, that attitude you describe on the part of young people, which is very real, and we were sort of talking about last week, not only is it not real, but it is also the attitude that seems to be shared by a lot of our politicians. Like, I think that a lot of people in Washington, including Republicans, have just sort of thrown up their hands. Like, this debt is just never going to come due. It's too big to even like fathom or think about, let alone think about solving. And so we just won't treat it like it's
the modern monetary theorist, right? It's money we owe ourselves, so it doesn't really matter.
Right.
Ultimately, the Fed and the wiser powers can kind of calibrate here and calibrate there. And anyone who's acquainted with the history of monetary crises and the history of monetary thought and theory and all the rest, and let alone the history of monetary policy, which encompasses the crises, of course, knows that our experiment with full fiat currency, that is currency completely untethered from commodity / currency, metal, say gold or silver, it's a pretty new experiment. I mean, it's only 50 years old or so. The complete severance gold window was closed by Nixon in the 70s, started by FDR, 30 years before that. So no, this could all, that's where the lack of sense of history and folly of human nature and all that seems to imbue the modern monetary theorist. So a real monetary crisis and hyperinflation is a real possibility. Although, we're helped by the fact that I forget who came up with this metaphor or analogy 10 years ago or more, one of these gold bug types or something. But the dollar has been appreciating against the euro over the last quarter significantly, and they're almost trading at parity, or they were 2 days ago or so. That's sort of unprecedented. We continue to be the best house in a bad neighborhood on sort of fiscal and monetary policy. That's not really totally true. I mean, our debt is sort of insane in many ways, but it's hard to say how long we could muddle along the way we are. But anyone who wants a picture of maybe crisis coming closer to us rather than us maintaining the status quo should check out Jeff Anderson's piece on debt from CRB Claremont Review Books a couple issues ago, which shows just we're at an rapidly accelerating pace of debt accumulation. This can't go on forever.
Great. And let me just quote J.P. Morgan here: "Gold is money. Everything else is debt."
Yeah, that Jeff Anderson piece is really good, and not only is it finely researched, but it manages to both drive home the sort of staggering, unfathomable extent and size of the debt, while also taking unlike most assessments of the situation, taking a very fine-grained and specific approach to how it might be solved, however politically remote the solutions might be.
A good thing to pair it with is another long essay written for us 2 years ago at least by Chris DeMuth called Trumpism, Nationalism, Populism, or some combination of those three. Chris, where Jeff gives the sort of fine-tooth debt treatment, Chris sort of goes through the political history of the last couple decades and sort of qualitatively assesses the prospects for us doing anything about the major crises. One of he concludes on the debt and spending thing, there's really no political appetite to do anything about it. So what rational citizens and sober statesmen in concert ought to be doing, including think tanks and policy people and all the rest, is preparing the plan to shove in front of the people who may be in a position to implement it when the currency debt crisis comes. That may be the only time you can really do anything about it. But we really need to prepare seriously for that outcome, because it's not only is it not impossible, but if current trends continue, which they have seemed to have accelerated over the last 40 years, it's inevitable.
In the short term, my European vacation coming up is going to be great. That's perhaps a cynical note to end on, but just but go read those pieces that Ryan is describing, and of course, I'm just kidding. That is all the time that we have. Thank you all for listening to the Roundtable. It's great to be back with you in a full crew. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. And don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. That's another great way to support the show. Leave us a 5-star review, or at least keep your criticisms to yourself. You can email them to me directly, because as I said last week, I actually really like reading our 1-star reviews. But don't post them, because they mess us up in the algorithm. Instead, give us a 5-star review, tell your friends, tell your mom, tell your kids, tell your wife, and we will talk to you next week.